It began with stress. At least, that's the neat clinical box I put it in. I was in my final year of a neuroscience graduate program, and my life had been reduced to a narrow, caffeine-fueled tunnel between the university lab and my small, cluttered apartment. My thesis was on the role of the amygdala in hypnagogic states, the strange, dreamlike borderlands between wakefulness and sleep. I was, academically speaking, an expert on the very tricks the mind plays on itself in the dark. I thought I understood the architecture of my own fear. I had no idea. Soft tone. The first time it happened, I had been awake for nearly 36 hours. Trying to wrangle a stubborn dataset into submission, I finally collapsed into bed around 4 o'clock in the morning, the words from my textbooks still chasing each other behind my eyelids. I fell asleep instantly, a deep, leaden, dreamless sleep. And then, I was awake, or I thought I was. My eyes were open. I could see my room, bathed in the sickly orange glow of the streetlight outside my window. I could see the familiar pile of textbooks on my desk, the clothes slung over my desk chair, the faint silhouette of the ficus tree in the corner. Everything was exactly as it should be. But I couldn't move. I tried to lift my head, but it was fused to the pillow. I tried to wiggle a finger, to bend a toe. Nothing. My body was a statue of meat and bone, and my consciousness was a terrified ghost trapped inside it. A primal, helpless panic, the kind I had only ever read about in case studies, washed over me. My limbs screamed with the effort of trying to move, but they remained perfectly, horribly still. It felt like my brain had been disconnected from its own hardware. Then came the pressure. It started as a faint weight on my chest, like a cat had settled there. But it grew, intensifying with impossible speed, from a cat to a dog, to a fully grown man, to a block of solid concrete. It was a crushing, suffocating weight that stole the air from my lungs. I tried to scream, to force a single, desperate gasp of air, but my throat was paralyzed, my vocal cords locked in concrete. All I could manage was a faint, pathetic, internal wheezing. A low, vibrational hum began to fill the room, a sound so deep I felt it in my teeth, the resonant frequency of pure dread. That's when I saw them. At first, it was just a flicker of movement in the deepest shadows under my desk, a twitch of something dark, a shape that scuttled just at the edge of my vision. I tried to focus on it, but it was like trying to see a word that was just off the page. Then another flicker, near the closet. They were low to the ground, all sharp, unnatural angles, moving with the jerky, broken-legged gait of a dying insect. They were silhouettes, patches of darkness that seemed to drink the already dim light. And they were crawling, skittering, exploring the edges of my room. They were the crawlers. The scientific part of my brain, buried deep beneath the avalanche of terror, was desperately trying to assert itself. Hypnagogic hallucination. It whispered, atonia. Common symptoms of narcolepsy and severe sleep deprivation. The brain is awake, but the body's motor functions are still in REM sleep paralysis. The figures are just projections from the amygdala, the brain's fear center. I clung to those words, to the clinical, Latinate terms, like a holy man clutching a crucifix in the face of a demon. But the demon wasn't listening to my diagnosis. As the crawlers continued their silent, frantic patrol of the floor, a new shape began to resolve itself in the darkened doorway of my bedroom. It was taller, humanoid, but unnaturally thin. Its limbs too long, its proportions all wrong. It was a perfect two-dimensional silhouette, a hole cut into the fabric of the world. It didn't move. It just stood there, perfectly still, its featureless head tilted slightly, as if it were studying me. A watcher. The pressure on my chest intensified. The humming grew louder. My silent internal screams were a constant, useless roar. The watcher in the doorway did not approach. It did not threaten. It just observed. Its stillness was a profound, terrifying violation. It was the stillness of a biologist staring through a microscope at a specimen pinned to a slide. And the specimen was me. I was completely, utterly helpless. a conscious mind laid bare for the inspection of this silent, impossible entity. I don't know how long it lasted. Seconds, minutes, an eternity. I spent that timeless period doing the only thing I could. I tried to force myself awake, to break the connection. I focused all my will, all my terror, on a single point, my right index finger. I poured every ounce of my being into that one simple command: move. I felt the phantom strain of muscles, the scream of neurons firing against a dead connection. Move, move, move. And then, with a convulsive, full-body jolt, I broke free. I launched myself upright in bed, a huge, ragged gasp of air tearing from my lungs. I was drenched in a cold sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it was going to break. I was shaking violently, but I was alone. The room was empty. The pressure was gone. The humming had stopped. There were no crawlers under the desk, no watcher in the doorway. There was only the quiet, familiar mess of my own room, the steady orange glow of the streetlight. In a hurried tone, I scrambled out of bed, my legs weak, and flicked on every light in the apartment. I checked the locks on the door, the windows. I looked in the closet, under the bed. Nothing. It was all exactly as I had left it. There was no one here. There had never been anyone here. I collapsed into my desk chair, my head in my hands, and took deep, shuddering breaths. The terror was already receding, being replaced by the cold, clear, and deeply reassuring voice of the scientist. It was a textbook case, a perfect storm of exhaustion, stress, and my own academic immersion in the subject. Sleep paralysis, atonia, hypnagogic hallucinations projected by the amygdala, the crushing weight on my chest, a misinterpretation of my own diaphragm's struggle to breathe in a paralyzed state. The humming, auditory hallucination, probably the sound of my own blood pressure roaring in my ears. The figures, classic archetypal manifestations of the subconscious. The shadow people. It was all there in the literature. It was a glitch in the brain, a terrifying but ultimately harmless neurological event. I sat there until the sun came up, the lights of my apartment blazing in defiance of the dawn. I had a rational, scientific explanation for everything I had experienced. I had it all contained, labeled, and filed away in a neat clinical box. I was safe. It was just a dream, a waking dream. But as I finally got up to make a pot of coffee, a small, treacherous, and utterly unscientific part of my mind whispered a question that I would spend the rest of my life trying to answer. If it was just a dream, why did it feel so much like I was being watched? The harsh light of day is a powerful antiseptic. In the morning, with the sun streaming through my window and a fresh pot of coffee brewing, the memory of the night's terror seemed absurd, a phantom from a world that couldn't possibly be real. My scientific mind, my rational, ordered consciousness, reasserted its dominance with the dawn. I went to the lab and I treated my own experience as I would any other data point, a problem to be analyzed, deconstructed, and solved. I spent the next 2 days in a feverish, almost manic state of research, not on my thesis, but on myself. I pulled every study, every textbook, every clinical trial on sleep paralysis and hypnagogic phenomena I could find. The diagnosis was, on the surface, textbook. Atonia, the temporary paralysis of the body during REM sleep, had momentarily persisted into a waking state. The figures were classic hypnagogic hallucinations, the brain's fear center in the amygdala painting the darkness with archetypal threats. The contributing factors were all there: severe sleep deprivation, high stress levels, an irregular sleep schedule. I created a protocol, a treatment plan for myself, as if I were my own patient. Number 1, regulate sleep. Bed at 10 o'clock, up at 6 o'clock, no exceptions. Number 2, eliminate stimulants. Coffee would be replaced by herbal tea. Number 3, reduce stress. I would practice mindfulness meditation for 30 minutes before bed. It was a solid, evidence-based plan. I was a scientist. I would control the variables, and I would fix the glitch in my own wetware. But there was a flaw in the data, a detail that my scientific honesty couldn't ignore: the consistency. Most reported hypnagogic events were chaotic, fluid, dreamlike. My experience had been structured. It had rules. The humming, the pressure, the arrival of the crawlers, then the watcher. It had the feeling of a procedure, a sequence of events. It was an anomaly within the anomaly, a statistical improbability that I noted in my journal with a small, uneasy question mark. That night, I followed my new protocol perfectly. I finished my work by 9 o'clock. I drank a cup of chamomile tea. I meditated, focusing on my breathing, willing my overactive mind into a state of calm. I went to bed at exactly 10 o'clock, my room quiet, my mind, I thought, at peace. I fell asleep easily, and then I was awake again. The freeze was instantaneous. My eyes snapped open to the familiar orange glow of the streetlight, my body once again a prisoner of its own stillness. The humming started, a low, clean thrum that vibrated through my mattress. The crushing weight descended on my chest. The protocol had failed. This time, I tried to be an observer. This is a neurological event, I told myself, my internal voice, a desperate clinical whisper against the rising tide of panic. Observe the hallucinations. Document the sequence. The crawlers came first. As before, their silent, broken movements a chaotic dance in the shadows. But there were more of them now, a dozen at least, their dark forms skittering just at the edge of my vision. Increased subject numbers, I noted mentally, my attempt at scientific detachment feeling pathetic and absurd. Then came the watchers. Not one, but three. One stood in the doorway, as before. Another materialized in the corner by the ficus tree. The third stood by my desk. They were pillars of silent, absolute blackness, their presence turning my small apartment bedroom into a sterile observation theater. My heart hammered against the immense pressure on my chest. I felt a profound, primal terror, the fear of a trapped animal surrounded by silent, patient predators. They just stood there, their featureless heads all angled slightly towards me, and they watched. And then he appeared. At the foot of my bed, where there had been nothing but empty space, a new figure resolved itself from the shadows. It was taller than the others, more defined, its silhouette sharp and impossibly black. It was the shape of a man in a long coat, and on his head, he wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast his unseen face into an even deeper darkness. The Hat Man. My carefully constructed wall of scientific rationalization crumbled into dust. I knew this figure, not personally, but I knew him from the fringe literature, from the folkloric accounts that are often dismissed in mainstream neuroscience. The Hat Man, a recurring cross-cultural archetype in sleep paralysis visions across the globe, a figure so consistent across thousands of unrelated accounts that some researchers had labeled him a psychic archetype, a universal symbol of dread hardwired into the human subconscious. To see him here, in my room, was a direct, terrifying contradiction to my theory of a personal, stress-induced hallucination. This wasn't my subconscious. This was something else, something ancient and shared. His presence was different from the others. The crawlers felt mindless. The watchers felt like automated sensors. The Hat Man felt intelligent. He was the lead scientist. The other figures in the room seemed to defer to him, their silent observation now feeling like it was being directed by his commanding, central presence. He stood at the foot of my bed, as still as the others, but his stillness was heavier, more potent. It was the stillness of a predator that knows its prey cannot escape. The terror was absolute. My mind, stripped of its scientific armor, was left naked and screaming. "Let me up," I roared internally, a useless silent blast of pure will. Let me out. I threw every ounce of my consciousness, every fiber of my being, into breaking the paralysis. I fought against the crushing weight, against the humming, against the silent, watching eyes of the things that had invaded my room. I felt a synaptic connection spark, a single nerve in my left foot twitching. I focused on it, held onto it, and pulled. With a violent electric jolt, my entire body convulsed. I launched myself into a sitting position, a ragged, desperate scream tearing from my throat, and I was alone. The room was empty. The figures were gone. The only sound was my own harsh, panicked breathing echoing in the quiet apartment. The only pressure on my chest was the frantic beating of my own heart. I sat there shaking, in a room that was suddenly far too bright, the single orange streetlight outside feeling like an interrogator's lamp. The nights that followed were a repeating, waking nightmare. My protocol was useless. Every night, at a different time. Sometimes at 2 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes just moments after I'd fallen asleep. The freeze would take me, and every night, the script would be the same. The hum, the pressure, the frantic dance of the crawlers, the silent, multiplying watchers, and the calm, commanding presence of the Hat Man, standing at the foot of my bed, a silent, dark priest, presiding over my nightly torture. The repetition was the most terrifying part. It was not a random glitch. It was a scheduled, recurring visitation. My life became a tale of two people. By day, I was Dr. Leo Reed, the detached scientist, a man surrounded by the comforting logic of data and peer-reviewed studies, a man who spoke of the brain's elegant, explainable machinery. But by night, I was just Leo, a terrified, helpless subject, pinned to a board in a silent, dark laboratory. My only company, the things that came from a place my science could not explain and would not save me from. I was losing. My research, my logic, it was all a shield, and it was cracking. I sat at my desk late one night, a textbook open to a chapter on cross-cultural mythology, a small section detailing the folkloric entity known as the Man in the Hat. I looked from the clinical, dismissive text on the page to my own exhausted, terrified reflection in the dark screen of my computer. The researcher was a fraud. The subject was the only thing that was real. It's not a hallucination, I thought. The words a final, terrible surrender to the truth. It's a visitation. There is a special kind of exhaustion that comes from being at war with your own mind. In the weeks that followed the first appearance of the Hat Man, my life bifurcated into two distinct, horrifying realities. There was the daytime Leo, a haggard, sleep-deprived ghost haunting the university library, his hands trembling as he tried to focus on fMRI scans, his academic performance plummeting. Then there was the nighttime Leo, a paralyzed, silent victim in a nightly theater of the absurd, a man who knew the precise number of floorboards between his bed and the closet where a watcher always stood. The two were supposed to be separate, a nightmare confined by the boundary of sleep. But the boundary was beginning to fray, the walls were thinning. It started in my peripheral vision. I'd be walking across the sunlit campus quad, and I'd see it, a tall, dark, unnaturally thin shape, standing perfectly still, under the shade of a distant oak tree. I would turn my head to look directly, my heart leaping into my throat, and there would be nothing there but the dappled play of light and shadow. I'd be in the library stacks, reaching for a book, and I'd catch a fleeting, skittering movement on the floor at the far end of the aisle, a shape like a broken spider that would vanish the moment I focused on it. At first, I dismissed it as a classic symptom of sleep deprivation. The overtired brain is notorious for creating phantom movements in the periphery. It was a logical, comforting explanation. But the sightings became more frequent, more defined. They were my nightly visitors, my silent, shadowy companions, and they were no longer content to wait for me to be asleep. They were beginning to bleed through the edges of my waking world, little glitches in the matrix of my sanity. Then came the hum. It had been the soundtrack to my paralysis, a low vibrational thrum that signaled the beginning of each episode. Now, I started to hear it when I was awake. It would be faint, almost subliminal, a ghost of a sound hiding beneath the noise of the world. I'd be in a bustling coffee shop, the air filled with the roar of the espresso machine and the chatter of students, and suddenly I would feel it more than hear it, that deep, familiar hum, a cold, resonant note that cut through the chaos and spoke directly to the fear in my gut. I would look around, my eyes darting from face to face, but no one else seemed to notice. It was a private broadcast, a chilling reminder that the connection, once established, was never truly turned off. The event that finally and completely shattered the barrier between my two worlds happened in the one place I still considered a sanctuary, my lab. It was late, almost midnight on a Thursday. I had been trying to work, to force my exhausted mind to focus on the familiar, comforting data of my thesis. The lab was a sterile, white, logical space, a temple of reason and verifiable facts. It was the antithesis of the dark, irrational chaos of my bedroom. It was my last safe place. I was sitting at my workstation, analyzing a series of brain scans, when the overhead fluorescent lights began to flicker. Not the gentle, occasional flicker of a dying bulb, but a frantic, rhythmic strobing, as if a switch were being flicked on and off with impossible speed. The sensitive EEG monitor on the desk beside me, which had been tracking baseline neural activity, suddenly went haywire. The calm, rhythmic lines dissolved into a chaotic, nonsensical scribble, the machine letting out a high-pitched electronic squeal of protest, and the hum started. It wasn't the faint, subliminal hum of the coffee shop. It was the full, room-pressurizing, bone-vibrating thrum of my paralysis. It was here. It had followed me. In a hurry tone, I pushed my chair back, my heart pounding, my gaze fixed on the long, sterile, white corridor that led to the lab's main door. I had to get out. I had to run, but I was frozen in place, not by paralysis, but by a deep, instinctual terror that told me it was already too late. At the far end of the corridor, in the deep shadows beyond the last flickering light, a shape began to resolve itself. It was a watcher, tall, thin, a perfect, two-dimensional cutout of absolute black against the white walls. It wasn't a fleeting glimpse. It wasn't a trick of my peripheral vision. It was there, solid, steady, real. It stood there for a full 10 seconds, a silent, dark sentinel in my temple of science, its featureless head tilted in that familiar, analytical way. It was looking at me. It knew I could see it, and it wanted me to know. Then, as if it had never been, it dissolved, the darkness of its form bleeding back into the normal shadows of the hallway. The lights stopped flickering and returned to their steady, humming glow. The EEG monitor flatlined and then rebooted, its screen returning to a calm, normal baseline. The hum faded, leaving a silence that was somehow louder and more terrifying than the noise had been. My carefully compartmentalized life, my desperate attempt to separate the rational day from the monstrous night, had failed completely. The monster had just walked out of my bedroom and into my laboratory. There were no more safe spaces. My work, my science, the very foundation of my identity, was a lie. I was a neuroscientist who could no longer trust his own neurology. The days that followed were a steep, downward spiral. My fear of sleep became a phobia. I started seeing the irony in it. My thesis was on sleep, and now the very act of it was a source of profound, existential terror. I tried to fight it. I drank coffee until my hands shook so badly. I took long, aimless walks through the city in the dead of night, just to keep moving, to keep my mind from the dangerous precipice of exhaustion. My colleagues started to notice. My thesis advisor, a kind, patient man named Dr. Evans, pulled me aside after a meeting where I had been unable to answer a simple question. "Leo," he said, his face etched with concern. "You look terrible. You've lost weight. You're distracted. Is everything all right at home?" I just nodded, unable to form the words to explain. "I'm being haunted, Dr. Evans. Not by ghosts, but by my own brain, or maybe by things from another dimension. They visit me every night and stand in the corners of my room and watch me. Oh, and I saw one in the lab last night. They would have me in a padded room before the sun went down." I was completely, utterly alone with this. The segment ends with me in my apartment. It is 3 o'clock in the morning. I haven't slept in 2 days. I'm sitting in my uncomfortable desk chair, the main room light on, a book open in my lap, Though I haven't turned a page in an hour, my body is a war zone of conflicting signals, every cell screaming for the release of sleep, every synapse screaming in terror at what sleep will bring. The hum is a faint, constant presence. I see a flicker of movement near the closet. I don't even flinch anymore. They are always here now, just waiting. I look at my bed, at the soft pillow and the inviting comforter. It is not a place of rest. It is an altar, an examination table, a doorway to a silent, freezing hell. I know I can't stay awake forever. Sooner or later, my body will betray my mind, and they will be waiting. The human body is a stubborn, traitorous machine. For 3 nights, my mind, fueled by a desperate, terrified will, had won the war against sleep. I existed in a gritty, grey, half-real world, sustained by the dregs of lukewarm coffee and sheer anxious momentum. But the body's needs are more fundamental than fear. On the 4th night, sitting in my armchair, a dense textbook of neuroimaging open on my lap, my traitorous body finally surrendered. My head slumped forward, and I fell into the abyss. In a hurried tone, the fall was instantaneous. There was no gentle descent, no soft borderlands of drowsiness. One moment, I was fighting to keep my eyes open. The next, they were open, and I was frozen. The paralysis was more violent this time, a full-body seizure that locked every muscle into a state of absolute, screaming tension. The hum was not a subtle vibration. It was a deafening, discordant roar that filled the room. The sound of a universe tearing at its seams. The pressure on my chest was a physical, malevolent weight, a crushing, sharp-edged stone that promised to splinter my ribs and collapse my lungs. The room was cold, a deep, penetrating, unnatural cold that felt like it was radiating from the shadows themselves. And the room was full. The crawlers were a frantic, seething carpet of disjointed limbs and absolute blackness, their skittering movements now seeming to have a terrifying purpose, as if they were preparing the space, setting the stage. And the watchers, God, the watchers. They lined the walls of my small bedroom, a silent, motionless jury of a dozen or more, their tall, thin silhouettes packed shoulder to shoulder. My bedroom was no longer a room, it was an arena, and my paralyzed, helpless body was the main event. I tried to retreat into my scientific mind, but there was nowhere left to go. My rationalizations were a ruined city, my theories a pile of smoldering ash. All I had left was the raw, unfiltered, primal terror of a conscious mind trapped in dead meat, about to be vivisected by ghosts. My eyes, the only part of me I could still control, darted around the room, cataloging the horrors. And then I saw him, the Hat Man. He was there, at the foot of my bed, just as he had been every night. But this time, the silent, patient observation was over. The main event was about to begin. He moved. It wasn't a walk. It was a silent, fluid glide, as if the floor were a sheet of frictionless ice. He moved from the foot of the bed to the side, his tall form eclipsing the orange glow of the streetlight, plunging my side of the room into an even deeper darkness. He stood over me, a towering column of pure void, and he leaned down. I was paralyzed, helpless, forced to stare up into the featureless, light-devouring blackness of his hat-brimmed head. I could feel a strange energy coming off of him, a tangible field of cold and profound, ancient intelligence. No, my mind screamed. A useless, silent roar of defiance. Get away from me! Don't touch me! He raised a long, slender arm, the limb unfolding from his long coat, like the leg of a spider. The hand was a thing of pure nightmare. All long, thin, tapering fingers made of solid shadow. It moved slowly, deliberately, down towards my face. I tried to flinch, to turn my head, to do anything, but the paralysis held me fast. I was pinned, a butterfly on a board, watching the needle descend. The tip of his shadowy finger touched the center of my forehead. The contact was not physical. There was no pressure, No sense of touch on my skin. It was a jolt of pure metaphysical energy, a blast of impossible, absolute cold shot from the point of contact, directly into the center of my brain. It was a cold that burned, a cold that had a sound, the sound of a million tiny shards of glass grinding together, the same static from the very first episode, now amplified into a deafening, mind-shattering roar. And with the sound, with the cold, came a message. It was not in a language. It was a pure conceptual download, an infusion of knowledge so alien and so absolute that it bypassed all my senses, all my learning, and imprinted itself directly onto my consciousness. In that single timeless moment of contact, I knew that they were not hallucinations, not projections of my own fear. They were real. They were entities, observers from a place without light or sound, a silent, timeless dimension that existed alongside our own. I knew that they were not ghosts of the dead, but something far, far older, and I knew with a certainty that was more terrifying than any other revelation that I had been chosen, selected, for some specific, unknown quality in my own consciousness that had made me perceptible to them. They were not haunting me, they were studying me. The jolt of the information, the sheer alien weight of the knowledge, was too much for my human nervous system. It was like a lightning strike to my brain, and it short-circuited everything. The paralysis broke. A raw, agonized scream tore from my throat as my body convulsed, a violent, thrashing rejection of the alien contact. I threw myself sideways, off the bed, crashing onto the floor in a tangled heap of limbs and blankets. I scrambled backwards, crab-walking until my back hit the wall, my eyes wide, my body shaking uncontrollably. I was alone. The room was empty. The figures were gone. The humming had stopped, but the evidence of their visit was no longer just a fading, traumatic memory. The room was freezing. A deep, unnatural cold had saturated everything, a lingering chill left behind by their presence. I could see my own breath, a plume of white vapor in the air of my own bedroom, and my head was splitting with a searing, agonizing headache, a perfect burning point of pain centered on the exact spot on my forehead where the creature's finger had touched me. I curled into a ball on the floor, my arms wrapped around my head, and I wept, not from fear anymore, but from a new, more profound emotion, the horror of absolute, confirmed knowledge. The walls of my science, of my rational world, had not just been cracked, they had been atomized. There was no theory, no diagnosis, no comforting psychological model that could contain what had just happened. I had been touched. I had been communicated with. An impossible non-human intelligence had reached across the veil of reality and put its finger on my soul. I was no longer a scientist studying a symptom in a lab. I was the lab, and the experiment had just begun. The morning after the touch was unnervingly quiet. The searing headache had receded, leaving behind a dull, phantom ache and a strange tingling numbness on my forehead. A psychic bruise where the shadow's finger had rested. I moved through my apartment like a ghost, my own home now feeling like a contaminated zone, a place that was no longer exclusively mine. Every shadow seemed to hold a latent threat. Every quiet corner seemed to be watching. The scientific framework I had used to understand the world was a pile of rubble, and I was a refugee picking through the ruins of my own certainty. I had no explanation, no theory, no box to put the experience in. All I had was the cold, undiluted memory of the touch and the terrifying knowledge it had imparted. They were real. I was standing in my kitchen, staring blankly at a coffee pot I had no memory of turning on, when the morning sun finally crested the building across the street. A beam of bright golden light lanced through the window. It was the light that made me see it. A pattern, etched on the inside of the glass, was an intricate, complex lacework of frost. But it was July. The air outside was warm and humid. There should have been no frost. And this was not the random, chaotic crystal pattern of natural ice. It was a design, a perfect, impossibly detailed, and terrifyingly familiar geometric pattern. It was a massive, six-pointed snowflake, composed of the same sharp, alien symbols I had seen in my very first vision. The ones that had been burned into my mind during the migraines. It was a fingerprint, an insignia, a piece of residual art left behind by the night's impossible visitor. I approached the door as if it were a bomb. My breath held tight in my chest. The frost was real. I could feel its chill radiating through the air. I reached out a trembling finger and touched the glass. It was ice cold. As the sun warmed the room, I watched in horrified fascination as the beautiful, terrifying pattern began to melt. The intricate lines of frost beaded up, turned to water, and trickled down the glass, and within 10 minutes, it was gone, leaving no trace, no watermark, nothing but a clean pane of glass and the frantic hammering beat of my own heart. That pattern changed everything. The terror was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but now it had a new companion, the scientist. The phantom touch, the downloaded knowledge, those were subjective experiences, things a skeptic could dismiss as the products of a traumatized, sleep-deprived mind. But the frost, the pattern, that was objective, that was data. It was the first piece of physical, verifiable evidence that what was happening to me was not just in my head, it was in my room. My fear began to sharpen into a new, desperate kind of focus. I was no longer just a victim. I was an investigator, and this was the most important case of my life. I needed more proof. I needed to create an experiment, a controlled environment that could yield repeatable, physical results. I spent the day planning, my mind, for the first time in weeks, humming with a grim academic purpose. The plan was simple, almost childishly so, but its implications were profound. That evening, before I prepared for the nightly ordeal, I took a stack of my unbound thesis papers, 100 pages of dense, neurological research, and I arranged them in a single neat, perfectly aligned stack on the far corner of the desk. I took my phone and photographed the stack from 3 different angles, documenting its precise position. The hypothesis was simple. During the paralysis, I am verifiably, absolutely immobile. If the papers move, then something else, something with physical agency, is in the room with me. That night, I did not try to fight sleep. I went to bed with a strange, almost morbid sense of anticipation. I was willingly laying myself out as bait, turning my own nightly torture into a scientific experiment. The paralysis came, as it always did. A sudden, crushing weight. The hum filled the room. The crawlers skittered from the shadows. The watchers materialized in their silent sentinel positions. The Hat Man took his place at the foot of my bed. The terror was still immense, a primal, helpless screaming in the silent prison of my own mind. But beneath it, a new thought echoed. Do something. Move something. Show me you're real again. The entities just stood there, observing me as always. There was no touch this time, no direct interaction. It was just the same, long, terrifying vigil. I could see my desk in my peripheral vision. The stack of papers was a pale rectangular shape in the gloom, still neat, still untouched. A part of me, the part that still desperately craved a rational explanation, was relieved. The other part, the scientist, was disappointed. The experiment was failing. The paralysis released me just before dawn. The jolt leaving me gasping in the cold, silent room. My first frantic thought was of the desk. I scrambled out of bed and flicked on the lamp, my eyes darting to the corner. The papers were everywhere. It was a scene of chaos. The neat stack was gone. Pages were scattered across the floor, some crumpled, some flat. A few sheets were on my chair. Another was halfway under my bed. It was as if a powerful, violent gust of wind had erupted in the center of my sealed, locked, and entirely draft-free room. My hands shaking, I grabbed my phone and took the after pictures. The evidence was undeniable. Between the time the paralysis began and the time it ended, a significant kinetic event had occurred in my room, and I hadn't moved a muscle. The proof was for me, but it wasn't enough. A skeptic would say I had thrashed in my sleep, that I had a waking episode I didn't remember. I needed a witness, an objective, impartial observer who could record the events without bias or interpretation. I needed a camera. The decision was the final, logical step in my scientific protocol. I spent the day's meager research grant on a high-quality, motion-activated, night vision camera and a wide-angle lens. I set it up on top of my bookshelf, the lens encompassing my bed, my desk, and the doorway in a single static shot. I positioned a digital clock so it would be clearly visible in the frame. I had my impartial observer that evening. As I prepared for bed, the atmosphere in the room was different. The familiar dread was there, but it was overlaid with a tense, electric anticipation. I was no longer just a subject, a helpless specimen. I was now a collaborator in the experiment. I was a scientist, about to observe the impossible. I looked at the camera, its small professional form, a reassuring presence in the corner. Its tiny red recording light was a single, defiant, technological eye, staring back at the darkness. It was my eye. It would stay open when mine were frozen in terror. It would watch when I could not. I got into bed, the sheets feeling cold and stiff. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling, waiting. The hum would start soon. The pressure would come. They would arrive. But tonight, I would not be alone. Tonight, we would see what the camera could see. Tonight, everything would change. Lying down to sleep that night felt less like an act of rest and more like a willing sacrifice. I was placing myself on the altar. But this time, I had brought my own witness. The small, red, blinking light of the camera in the corner of the room was a tiny, defiant star in the darkness, a promise that tonight's horrors would not go unrecorded. I lay perfectly still on my back, my eyes open, and waited for the inevitable. I didn't have to wait long. The paralysis came like a switch being thrown. One moment, I was a man in a bed. The next, a ghost in a machine. The hum flooded the room, a physical presence that vibrated in my bones. The crushing weight descended, squeezing the air from my lungs. I was a prisoner once more. My eyes, the only part of me that could move, darted towards the camera. The little red light was still blinking. It was working. A strange, grim satisfaction cut through my terror. See this, I thought, a desperate, silent plea to the impartial lens. See what's happening to me. They came. The crawlers first, a frantic, silent tide of disjointed shadows. Then the watchers, materializing in their usual positions, a silent, standing jury. And finally the Hat Man, a column of absolute void at the foot of my bed. The nightly ritual began, the long, silent vigil. But tonight, my fear was mixed with a clinical, detached curiosity. I tried to be a better observer. I noted their positions relative to the camera's field of view. The Hat Man was in a perfect, unobstructed shot. One of the watchers stood directly beside the desk where I had stacked the papers. The scene was perfectly set. All my variables were in place. The eternity of the paralysis finally ended, with the familiar, violent jolt of release. I gasped for air, my body drenched in sweat. But I didn't scream this time. My first frantic action was to look at the camera on the bookshelf. The little red light was off. A cold, sick dread washed over me, more chilling than any ghost. It had failed. The battery had died. The memory card had filled up. 1,000 mundane, technical failures that would leave me alone with my story, a madman with no proof. With trembling, clumsy fingers, I ejected the small memory card. It felt warm to the touch. I didn't bother getting dressed. I took the card to my desk, my heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm. This was it, the moment of truth. I slid the card into my laptop's reader and clicked on the single, large video file. I took a deep breath and hit play. The beginning was excruciatingly normal. The grainy green and black footage showed my room, empty, for a few minutes. Then I entered the frame, went through my nightly routine, and got into bed. The digital clock on the nightstand was clearly visible, its numbers glowing a soft red. 11:13 p.m. I watched myself toss and turn for half an hour, a stranger in my own bed. Then, at 11:48 p.m., I watched my sleeping form go suddenly, unnaturally rigid. I saw my own eyes snap open, staring blankly at the ceiling. The paralysis had begun. On the video's audio track, the low vibrational hum was clearly audible, a sound that made the small speakers of my laptop buzz. In a hurried tone. This was it. The proof. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes wide, waiting for the first crawler to skitter into view. But it never did. The exact second my eyes snapped open on screen, the video feed dissolved into a violent, chaotic blast of digital static. It was not a simple loss of signal. It was an assault. A snowstorm of screeching, shrieking white and black pixels filled the screen. The audio track, which had been humming, erupted into a high-pitched, electronic scream, a sound like a modem being tortured. The numbers on the digital clock in the frame became a corrupted, unreadable jumble, flickering between alien symbols and fragmented digits. "No," I whispered, my voice a choked, strangled sound. "No, no, no." I grabbed the mouse and fast-forwarded, dragging the playhead through the timeline. The static was relentless, a solid, impenetrable wall of digital noise. I did a quick calculation, looking at the file's total runtime. The static lasted for 1 hour and 12 minutes, the same subjective eternity I had spent frozen in my bed. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the static ended. The video feed snapped back to a clear, stable, night vision image. The electronic screaming was gone, replaced by the simple, ambient silence of my room. The digital clock was now clear and readable again. 1 a.m., a solid, missing block of time. On the screen, my paralyzed form was still frozen on the bed, my eyes still open. But the room was different. The stack of research papers, which in the footage from 11:47 p.m. had been a neat, perfect rectangle on my desk, was now a chaotic mess, strewn across the floor. I played the footage back again, and again. The story it told was both a perfect confirmation and a devastating, absolute failure. I had my proof. The scattered papers were the undeniable evidence that a physical force had been present in the room while I was immobile. But the entities themselves, the source of it all, were completely, utterly invisible. They were not just shadows. They were a blind spot in reality, a phenomenon that technology itself could not perceive. Their very presence was a reality-distorting field, so alien and so other, that it didn't just hide from the camera, it actively broke it, corrupting the recording, erasing its own presence from the objective record. It was a ghost that not only couldn't be photographed, but which destroyed the camera that tried. Driven by a final, desperate scientific impulse, I extracted the corrupted section of the video file and ran it through a signal analysis program. It was not random noise. Buried deep within the visual static, I found them. Faint, repeating, geometric patterns. The same impossible symbols from my visions, hidden in the digital chaos like a subliminal watermark. The audio signal was not random either. The program identified it as a multi-layered, complex signal of immense bandwidth, but it could not be decrypted. It was a language my science had no key for. I leaned back in my chair, the morning sun now streaming through my window, feeling colder than any ghost. The recording was the final, brutal truth. It was a message, not from them, but from the universe itself. And the message was clear. You are alone with this. I had captured the miracle, the impossibility, the smoking gun, and the evidence was nothing more than a corrupted video file and a story that no rational person would ever believe. The horror had shifted again. It was no longer just the fear of the nightly visitation. It was the profound, existential terror of being trapped in a version of reality that only I could see, a reality that the world itself seemed determined to hide. I had looked the monster in the face, and I had taken its picture, but the photograph was completely, utterly blank. Resignation is a quiet, hollow place. After the failure of the recording, a part of me gave up. The fight was over, and I had lost. My life became a grim, predictable cycle. By day, I was a ghost, a hollowed-out shell of a student who haunted the university's labs and libraries. My contributions to conversations, nothing more than tired monosyllables. I submitted my thesis, a document I barely remembered writing, its pages filled with the cold, detached science that had so utterly failed to protect me. By night, I was a stone. I would lie down in bed, turn on the camera out of a pointless, lingering habit, and I would wait. The paralysis would come. The hum, the pressure, the silent, watching figures would fill my room, and I would simply endure it. A silent, conscious statue, waiting for the morning's violent, jolting release. I was a man living in two realities, and both were a kind of hell. I had grown accustomed to the horror, or so I thought. I had learned the script, the rhythm of the nightly visitation. I was a prisoner who had memorized the guards' patrol routes. But one night, the script changed, the routine was broken, and I learned that there are depths of terror that you cannot become accustomed to. It began with the hum. It was deeper, more powerful, a resonant, bone-jarring vibration that made the very air in the room feel thick and heavy. The pressure on my chest was not just a weight. It was an active, crushing force, a promise of annihilation. The paralysis was absolute, a cage of iron. And when they came, they all came. The room was crowded, the shadows so thick with their forms, it felt like the walls themselves had been replaced by them. Dozens of watchers stood shoulder to shoulder, their silent, collective gaze a physical weight. It felt like a gathering, a final presentation, a sentencing. The Hat Man was not at the foot of my bed. He was standing directly beside me, looming over my frozen form, a towering column of absolute night. The sense of intelligent, focused purpose coming from him was overwhelming, a silent roar of consciousness that drowned out my own thoughts. I was no longer an interesting specimen being observed from a distance. I was the subject, and the lead scientist was about to begin the final, hands-on procedure. He leaned down. His featureless, ovoid head descended, until it was just inches from my own. I was forced to stare into the void of his face, a patch of reality so black it seemed to curve inwards. I braced myself for the icy, static-filled touch of his finger, but he did not touch me. Instead, a voice bloomed in the center of my mind. It was not a sound, it was a silent, perfect, and utterly alien transmission of pure concept. It was the same sensation as the touch, but this time it was not a jolt of information, it was a conversation. "We have observed," the thought voice said. It was calm, cold, and possessed a timeless, ancient quality. "Your reality is a chaotic, temporary medium, a sea of random, energetic noise. We are the shore. We are the silence. We observe the patterns in the chaos." I was a captive audience to a lecture from a demigod. My terror was so profound, it almost became a kind of detached awe. "Your consciousness is an anomaly of particular interest," the voice continued. "Your mind, it is a bridge, the analytical and the primal, the logical and the terrified. It creates a unique, vibrant resonance, a bright signal in the noise. It is a window. My soul, my fear, my entire being was nothing more than a convenient viewpoint for these cosmic voyeurs. But your biological form is inefficient," the voice impressed upon me, the concept carrying a feeling of almost clinical pity. "It is fragile. It requires rest. The constant transition between your waking state and the paralysis state, in which we can most clearly observe, creates distress, friction. It is a flawed, painful process for you. It corrupts the quality of the observation." I could feel a new idea being presented, a solution, a proposal. "There is another option," the thought voice explained, "a more efficient, more permanent state. Your consciousness is the signal. Your body is merely the crude, temporary hardware that generates it. The tether between them can be severed. A new, more profound wave of terror crashed over me, a horror beyond anything I had yet experienced. No, not that. The nightly terror you experience is a side effect of your resistance, the Hat Man explained, his logic inescapable, his argument terrifyingly reasonable. Your mind clings to its temporary, physical anchor. This is the source of your suffering. If you let go, the suffering will end. We offer you an escape, an invitation. And then came the final, terrible offer. Stop being the observed. Become the observer. Relinquish your hold on the noisy, painful chaos of your world. Let the tether break. Join us in the timeless, silent, and perfect void. Your consciousness will be preserved. Your suffering will end. You will simply watch forever. It was an invitation to a kind of eternal life, and a sentence to a kind of absolute death. To become a ghost, to become one of them. He presented the choice, a forked path laid out in the center of my soul, an eternity of this nightly torture, or a single, final moment of terror, followed by an eternity of silent, bodiless peace. We will wait, the voice said, and then it was gone, leaving only the impossible choice hanging in the silent, humming air of my mind. The Hat Man did not move. He stood over me, a silent, patient statue, waiting for my answer. The watchers stood along the walls, their silent vigil no longer just an observation, but an honor guard, waiting to escort me to my own damnation or to preside over my continued torture. And the paralysis did not end. I lay there, a conscious mind in a dead body, trapped not for an hour, but for an eternity. I felt the first, pale rays of the morning sun begin to warm the floor of my room. I heard the first, distant sounds of the waking city, the chirp of a sparrow, the rumble of the first bus of the day. The world outside my window was returning to its normal, noisy life. But my world was no longer a part of it. The freeze was permanent. My waking life had finally, completely, and irrevocably merged with the silent, timeless reality of the visitors. The sun is now streaming through my window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a beautiful, chaotic, and noisy display of a world I can no longer touch. My body lies here, a statue of cooling flesh, my heart still beating, my lungs still breathing, but my will is a prisoner. The Hat Man is still here, his featureless face inches from mine, his offer a silent, screaming question in my mind. He is waiting, with the infinite patience of a being for whom time is just another pattern to be observed. I am frozen, I am awake, and I think a single tear, the last, traitorous physical part of me that I can still control, is tracing a slow, warm path down my cheek.